a good 40 years before anyone ever reported Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. Now, there's other creatures that have evolved out here in this area. This has been sparsely populated by humans for all of time here in the Ozarks. And there's some birds of flight that live around here. In fact, there's one bird whose name is Giganticus. It's a big owl, and it has a 50-foot wingspan. Now, Giganticus has been known to swoop down and carry off naughty children. So if you know of any naughty children, you might want to keep an eye on them while you're here. Now, did you point at your friend? Now, this next story I heard about a bird, and honestly, I did think this was a little bit unbelievable. This bird is called the Philly Lou bird. And the Philly Lou bird has been known to fly upside down and backwards. And that's because the Philly Lou is more interested in where it's been than where it's going. Now, the Philly Lou bird has been known to carry off virtuous young maidens. So if you know of any virtuous young maidens, you might want to learn the Philly Lou call. Seriously, it goes something like this. Cookaree, cookaroo! Cookaroo, cookaree! Y'all can do that with me. Cookaree, cookaroo! Cookaroo, cookaree! Awesome. I did think that was a silly little story. We entertained them, didn't we? But I was laying on a dock on Table Rock Lake a couple years ago, just watching clouds float by overhead, and honest to goodness, I saw a bird that looked like it was flying upside down and backwards. Had a little orange tail feather that kind of mimicked a beak, and I do think that's the nugget of truth that got that little story going. And now there's a lot of beautiful spring water here in Eureka Springs. I don't know if y'all knew, our town was founded here because of the springs. 63 named springs within the city limits, 1,200 springs within a 7-mile radius. A lot of beautiful, clear spring water. But there's also some lovely rivers around here. And we have some man-made lakes. We've got Beaver Lake to the west, Table Rock Lake up north, and both of those lakes are fed by the White River. Now, there's a monster that lives in the White River, known as the White River Monster by tourists, but us locals, we just call him Whitey. Now, Whitey has been spotted in the White River from as far back as the Civil War days. In fact, Confederate soldiers at that time were using keelboats to supply their troops, and several of those boats were overturned, and they were overturned by people describe as a monster. And this monster is huge, this Whitey, this White River Monster. He's a boxcar wide, 2 or 3 boxcars long. His body is covered in a scaly gray skin. Some folks have seen a horn growing out of the top of his head. Now, people over the years, they've tried different things to get rid of Whitey. In fact, there was a plantation owner that had his plantation right there on the edge of the White River, and he had a little eddy there near his plantation, and several sightings of Whitey there in that eddy. And that plantation owner, he had some friends that were fishermen, and they really depended on being able to catch some fish to help feed their families. And anytime there was a sighting of Whitey in that eddy, the fishing would dry up. We don't know if Whitey was eating all the fish or just scaring them away. But this plantation owner decided he was going to help his friends out. He had a little plan. He got himself a bundle of dynamite, and his plan was to blow up that eddy. Next time he saw Whitey, anyway. Well, he started bragging about this plan to his friends and neighbors, and I don't know if y'all are aware of this. You guys are, because you're from Arkansas. We're known as the natural state, and we are not going to let some old coot blow up the river. So the state put a stop to that. But people over the years have tried different things. Folks have taken machine guns down to the river. They're going to shoot Whitey out. Way back in the 1930s, there was a town along the river called Newport, and the Newport Chamber of Commerce decided they were going to capitalize on the popularity of Whitey and actually capture this creature. Their plan was they were going to weave this rope net, stretch that net across the river, and when Whitey came swimming by, they'd be able to capture him. Now, this was during the Great Depression, and they were using donated rope to weave this net, and pretty soon they ran out of donations and didn't have any money to buy anymore, so that plan was abandoned. But there was an entrepreneur in the 1960s that set up an underwater viewing station. He charged folks admission. There were some steps to walk down, big plate glass window, and you could go down and look and see if you could get a glimpse of Whitey. Now, people have tried to capture a photo of Whitey. Divers have gone down. They always have a malfunction with their diving gear, and no one's got a good photo of him yet. But if you're out, any of you guys ever boat on Table Rock or Beaver? Good thing, because I think about people swimming in those lakes, boating, water skiing, and all that, and just imagine Whitey lurking below the surface. Something to think about if you're out on the river. Now, we've talked a little bit about creatures. I'd like to tell you a Cherokee tale. Y'all from Oklahoma, you may have heard this story before. This story was actually shared to me by a Cherokee man who grew up hearing this story from his grandfather in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and he loved the idea of me sharing this story with y'all, keeping the story alive. The Cherokee have actually traveled here to the Ozarks for hundreds of years. They would come here to use the sacred waters, they would hunt, they would fish, they would trade, and there were a small group of Cherokee at that time in the early 1800s that could see that their ancestral homelands back east were about to be completely overrun with European immigrants. So they decided to make a new home for themselves here in the West, here in the Ozarks, in this land that had been so good to them. And when they moved here, they continued to live in the old ways. They continued to use those sacred waters, they hunted, they fished, they traded, they cleared plots for gardens. They built themselves cabins here. And life for the Cherokee here in the Ozarks was good. But they didn't realize when they moved here, they hadn't come alone. They had been followed by some supernatural creatures called the night beings. Now, the most terrifying of the night beings is a creature called the raven mocker. Now, to see a raven mocker during the day, not a very impressive sight. Looks like a stooped over old man. Rounded shoulders, gnarled fingers, a bald head, broken and jagged teeth. But to see a raven mocker at night, completely different sight. A raven mocker at night flies through the air with a great rushing of wind. Sparks trail behind him, and he makes the cry of a raven to confuse anyone who might have seen him in flight. You see, the raven mocker preys on the weak and ailing. The raven mocker will enter his victim's home and torment them unmercifully. You see, the raven mocker's goal is to magically remove and consume his victim's heart. You see, for every day, week, year, or month that the raven mocker shortens his victim's life, that's a day, week, year, or month that is added to the raven mocker's life. Now, back in that day, there was a young Cherokee man living in this area named Redbird. Redbird was tall and he had broad shoulders, and he had a special skill. And that skill was he could speak both English and Cherokee. And with that skill, he obtained work from local farmers, chopping wood for them or clearing fields. And he had arranged to work for a local farmer and left from his cabin late in the day, knowing he was going to have to travel all through the night to reach this farmer's home at first light. Now, as he was traveling along the path on the way to this farmer's home, he got distracted by a very enticing smell. He could smell some roasting meat. Now, Redbird, he had come prepared. He had food along with him. He had brought some corn cakes wrapped in a cotton cloth in the pocket of his jacket. But this enticing smell of roasting meat was more than he could handle. So he decided to divert off the path and follow the source of that smell. And he followed the source of that smell all the way down to a decrepit old cabin at the bottom of the holler. Now, he could see smoke coming out of the chimney of that cabin, and he could see a fire glowing inside between the chinks between the logs. Now, he crept over to that cabin. He peeked between those logs, and there by the light of the fire, he saw this old man roasting meat on a spit. And he watched as that old man began to tear that barely cooked meat apart with his broken and jagged teeth. And Redbird realized he had stumbled upon the lair of a raven mocker. Now he saw this raven mocker begin to speak, and he pressed his ear up against that space, and he heard the raven mocker say, "I am still so hungry. That old man barely had a week left of his life, and I will need to feed again soon. But there is a young golden-haired girl in that cabin. I will come back tonight and take her heart and have it for my own. Now Redbird crept silently back to the path in the way that his uncles had taught him, and he continued on his way to the farmer's home. Now he reached the farmer's home at first light, and he greeted the farmer, and the farmer asked him if he wouldn't mind putting off chopping wood for another day. You see, their beloved grandfather had died mysteriously during the night, and the farmer asked Redbird if he wouldn't mind digging a grave instead. So Redbird labored through the morning to dig that grave, and when he finished, he retired to a respectful distance off in the woods. He watched as that family gathered around that grave, and he noticed in that family there was a young golden-haired girl. And Redbird realized this death had been due to the witchcraft of the Ravenmocker. Now Redbird was the son of a very important woman in the Paint Clan. Her name was Evening Star. And as Evening Star's son, he had learned many secrets from his aunts and uncles. And his mother had taught him the medicine to combat the Ravenmocker. So Redbird went off into the woods. He purified himself with some spring water. He chopped 4 stout cedar branches, and he gathered a bundle of dried oak. Now he went back to the farmer's home, and he sharpened each one of those cedar branches to a fine point. He planted 1 branch at each corner of the cabin with a pointed end going up. Now when the sun set, Redbird built a fire with that dried oak, and he sat around that fire, singing, praying, and smoking his sacred tobacco. He blew that smoke in all 7 directions. And Redbird, he called on the red man who's there when a warrior falls. He called upon the purple man who brings a warrior's strength in battle. And at that moment, he heard a great rushing of wind. He saw sparks trail through the sky, and he heard the cry of a raven. Now he saw this creature land on the roof of that farmer's cabin. And he heard that creature began to make some terrifying noises up on that roof. Now Redbird crept over to the one window of the cabin and peeked inside. And there, by the light of the fire, he saw that young golden-haired girl. She was laying on a pallet in front of the fire that her family had made for her. And she was being tormented unmercifully. That Ravenmocker was poised over her with his bald head, his gnarled fingers, his broken and jagged teeth, and he was pulling her from her pallet, and he was whispering in her ear, "I will take your heart and have it for my meal." Now, the Ravenmocker was invisible to everyone in the home except that poor girl who was there to prey on. Her family didn't know what was tormenting her, but Redbird, since he had the magic to combat the Ravenmocker, he could see completely what was going on, and he decided to enter that cabin. He went to the door, he eased it open, and he slipped inside. And once inside, he plucked a coal from the fire, lit his pipe of sacred tobacco, took a big puff off that pipe, blew that smoke right into the face of the Ravenmocker. Ah! The Ravenmocker cried and flew up the chimney. Now at that point, Redbird grabbed the farmer and they ran outside, and Redbird called on the red man and the purple man to bring his medicine strength, and at that moment, one of those sharpened cedar staves flew through the air and pierced the breast of the Ravenmocker. Now Redbird turned to the farmer and said, "I have mortally wounded the witch, but we must make sure your family is safe." So the farmer, he saddled 2 fine horses. In each scabbard, he put a rifle that could be shot many times without having to be reloaded. And Redbird and that farmer, they rode those horses hard. They rode those horses all the way down to that decrepit old cabin at the bottom of the holler. And when they reached that cabin, they dismounted their horses, walked to the doorway, and looked inside. And there, on the dirt floor, was that Ravenmocker, wounded and bleeding, that cedar stave half buried in his chest. And the farmer, he pulled out that rifle and he shot the Ravenmocker over and over again. Ha 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 ha! He merely laughed. Now at that point, Redbird pulled the farmer outside. They went off in the woods. They gathered a bundle of dried oak and holly and cedar, and they brought that wood back with them. They started a fire in the doorway of that cabin, and they watched the cabin burn to the ground. Now when the coals had cooled, Redbird sifted through the ashes till he found the bones of that raven mocker, and he began to crush those bones. He crushed those bones until they were only a coarse powder, and he threw that powder in a fire made of cedar wood, and he watched the bones burn a second time. Now when the bones had burned, Redbird turned to the farmer and said, "The witch is dead. Your family should be safe now." And the farmer, he thanked Redbird. He said, "You and your family will always be honored guests in my home." And as a token of his friendship, the farmer gave Redbird that fine horse and saddle and that mini-shot rifle. And that is the story of how Redbird killed his first raven mocker, made a lifelong friend, and came to own a fine horse and saddle and mini-shot rifle. Any of y'all ever heard that story before?
Mm-hmm.
I have had a few folks from Tahlequah say they grew up hearing that story, but not very many. It's a pretty unique. This next story, I want you guys to use your imagination. Not that you haven't been already. But I want you to think about what it would be like here in the dark in the Ozarks before we had lights. Before we had the gas street lights in town, before we had electric lights here at the hotel, way before we had all these solar lights here at the theater. I think the night could be pretty dark and terrifying here. In fact, our town was founded in 1879, and between 1879 and 1880, they killed over 100 bears and mountain lions that were living in the caves around here just so it would be safe for folks to raise a family. Now, another thing that could be a little bothersome if you were out on a dark night here in the Ozarks is if you didn't know where you're going, you could easily step off and end up 30 feet down in a ravine somewhere. But one thing that gave people a little added security back in those days before lights, if they were out in the dark here in the Ozarks, is to be on the back of a horse. I mean, horses are pretty sure-footed. I've been on the side of mountains on them, haven't had one fall off yet. So this story is about a young man that's out riding his horse on a cold, dark night. And this is the first cold snap of the season. You know, in the fall when it gets cold, everybody bundles up, gets their favorite sweater out and all that. That was that night. And this young man, he was out riding his horse. He had his hat pulled down over his ears, had his warmest gray wool scarf wrapped around his neck, had his coat buttoned all the way up to the top button. And he's just riding along. Clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop. So quiet that night, the only sound he could hear was the echoing of his horse's hooves off the canyon wall. And he noticed that it was so cold that night that he could see some steam coming out of his horse's nostrils. And he saw his own breath as well. Now he's riding along, clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop. When he comes around a corner and he sees a startling sight. He sees a startlingly beautiful young woman just standing there on the side of the road. But he was concerned. She was not dressed appropriately for the weather at all. She was just standing here on the side of the road wearing nothing but a lightweight calico dress. She didn't have a bonnet on her head or a shawl around her shoulders or nothing. And he didn't know why she'd be out there dressed that way. He thought maybe she'd been on a walk at dusk and lost her way, or maybe she'd ridden her own horse and been thrown and her horse had run on home. But he was concerned for this young lady's safety, so he stopped his horse and tipped his hat and said, "Good evening, ma'am. Could I be of service to you?" And she said, "Oh, thank you, sir. I sure could use a ride back to my rightful place." Now this young man, he was a little dumbfounded at this point. He had never ridden on the back of a horse with a young lady before. And he wasn't sure if this was quite proper. You know, back then, if he was going to court a young woman, he'd hitch up his horse and buggy and pick her up proper like that. Wasn't sure if it was okay to ride on the back of a horse with her, but he was so concerned about her safety, he offered her a boot and a hand, and he hoisted her on up, and she sat right there on the tail of the saddle blanket. Now, when she got up on the horse, she wrapped her arm around his waist. And he could feel her arm was cold to the touch. But she didn't seem to mind the cold. but he decided the gentlemanly thing, boy, I'm having fun. The gentlemanly thing to do would be to offer her that gray wool scarf. So he unwrapped that scarf, passed it back to her. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She put her other arm around his waist. Well, maybe we should just let them go on with this. I have a feeling the hotel's gonna crank that down a little bit. She wrapped both arms around his waist. She rested her cheek up against his strong back, and she whispered, "I'm all set. Let's go." And they took off. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. They're riding along, and this young man, he's really taken by her beauty. And he wanted to start a conversation with her. He thought he'd like to meet this young lady and maybe meet her pa and see if he could court her. And he was trying to come up with some words to break the ice, but he was a pretty shy guy. And pretty soon she did it for him. She said, "Sure is a nice evening, isn't it?" On this cold, dark night. All he could muster was, "Sure is." And they rode off in silence. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. Now they got about a mile down the road, and this young lady, she started to tap him on the shoulder saying, "This is it, this is my rightful place." Now he didn't recollect any houses being there by the burying grounds. And here they were at the gates to the cemetery. Now he did recall there's a brush arbor out there behind the cemetery, and sometimes traveling folks would camp behind that brush arbor. So he thought maybe she was part of one of these traveling families, and before he knew it, she'd hopped up that horse, and she was halfway through the tombstones before he realized she was still wearing his gray wool scarf. Now he figured that scarf was the perfect excuse to come back and see this young lady the next day. So he rode on home, went straight to bed. The next morning he was up before the chickens, did his chores, saddled his horse, and rode on out there to the burying ground. Now when he got to the cemetery, he saw someone had beat him there that morning. There was a horse and buggy tied up at the hitching post, and he saw a man standing amongst the graves. Now this man, he was wearing a top hat, and he had this frock coat, and he thought, well, surely this must be this young lady's pa. So he dismounted his horse, tied it up, and starts going towards this man. He wanted to see if he could meet him and see if he could ask to court his daughter. Now as he approaches this man, he recognizes him. This is the judge from the county seat. The young man had seen him around town before. And he said, well, what brings you so early this morning here, Judge? And the judge, his head was hanging. And he lifted his chin, and the young man saw a tear roll down his cheek. And the judge started to speak. He said, well, you see, son, 7 years ago last night, that my daughter was thrown from her horse about a mile from here and killed. And every year on this day, I come back here to visit her grave. And then the judge asked the young man, he said, what brings you here so early this morning, son? And the young man, he began to stammer, and he said, well, you see, I met this beautiful young girl last night, and she had these big brown eyes, this long flowing hair, and I just thought I wanted to meet her pa and see if I could court her. And the judge began to shake his head, and he knelt down in front of that grave. He picked up that gray wool scarf, and he began to speak. He said, you see, young man, you're the seventh person to give my daughter a ride back here to her rightful place. I think you might be needing this. He handed him the scarf. The young man took that scarf, he wrapped it around his neck. He unhitched his horse from the hitching post, and he began that long ride home. Now as he was riding along, he was replaying the events of the previous evening in his head. And he remembered that night. He could see the steam coming from his horse's nostrils. He could see his own breath as well, but he never saw that girl's breath. Now this young man, he got on with his life. He married a local girl, they raised a family, and they had a good life. But that young man, he never, ever forgot about that girl in the calico dress.